Welcome to Playback with another episode of history. You know, when most of us think of Winston Churchill, we picture the man who saved the West from fascism, right? But history, well, it's rarely that simple. Today, we're going to look at a much darker part of his story, one that you probably didn't learn about in school. It's really a tale of two Churchills. On one hand, you have the hero delivering those incredible, iconic speeches that rallied a nation, but at the very same time, a world away in Bengal, a horrifying catastrophe was unfolding. 3 million people, technically his subjects under the British Raj, were starving to death. The contrast is it's jarring and it forces you to ask some really tough questions. And here's the really tough part of the story we're looking at today. The argument is that this wasn't some unavoidable tragedy of war. The claim is that these 3 million people didn't die by accident. They died because of choices, deliberate choices, made by the very man so many of us call a hero. So, how on earth could that happen?
So let's dive into the first piece of this puzzle. The first thing to understand is that we're not talking about a natural disaster here. Some historians have called this a bureaucratic massacre. And it all starts with a very specific British military strategy.
Okay, so picture this. It's 1942. The Japanese army is literally at the border of India. The British are terrified of an invasion, so they implement something called the denial policy. This was a scorched earth strategy. They seized tens of thousands of local boats, and you have to understand, these boats were the lifeblood of the entire economy, and they destroyed huge stockpiles of rice, all to keep them out of enemy hands. The goal was military, sure, but the result for the people of Bengal was absolute economic ruin.
Now, of course, the standard defense you'll hear is that this was all just terrible timing, that the famine was caused by a massive cyclone or a simple crop failure. You know, a tragic act of nature made worse by the pressures of war, but ultimately, not anyone's fault.
But the numbers, they just don't back that up. The data tells a completely different story. Research shows that the amount of rice available in Bengal in 1943 was actually higher than it was in 1941, when there was no famine at all. So what does that mean? It means there was enough food. The problem wasn't a lack of food. It was that people were starving because the denial policy and crazy wartime inflation made it absolutely impossible for them to get it. But the story doesn't stop there. It gets worse, actually. The evidence we've looked at suggests this wasn't just a local crisis that London couldn't solve. It was about aid that was available, aid that was right there, but was actively, deliberately withheld. Just try to imagine this for a second. As millions are starving, the British Viceroy in India is sending frantic telegram after frantic telegram to London, begging for food shipments. At that exact moment, ships loaded with wheat from Australia are sailing right across the Indian Ocean. But they were under direct orders from Churchill's cabinet to sail straight past India. Their destination, the Mediterranean, to top up European stockpiles that were already pretty full.
And you know what the official excuse was? The reason they gave the viceroy in India? Sorry, no ships to spare. No ships. And yet, the records clearly show that at the same time, Britain was importing enormous amounts of food for its own people, just to keep a comfortable buffer stock. The message it sent, whether they meant to or not, was absolutely chilling. Some lives were simply valued more than others.
And this leads us to the most disturbing question in this whole story. Was this whole catastrophe just a result of gross incompetence, of wartime bureaucracy getting horribly tangled? Or was there something darker, something more intentional at play, an actual ideology that made it okay to just let these people die? And this is where we have to look at the man's own words, recorded by his own Secretary of State for India, Leopold Amory. When talking about the famine, Churchill is reported to have said this directly to him. This wasn't just some cold strategic calculation. This suggests his decisions may have been shaped by a deep personal contempt for the very people he was supposed to be governing. And listen, this wasn't some political rival or an enemy trying to smear him. This came from his own guy, a fellow believer in the British Empire. Amory was so appalled by Churchill's racism towards Indians that he privately wrote in his diary that he couldn't see much of a difference between Churchill's attitude and Hitler's. When your own cabinet member is making that comparison, that is a massive red flag. So while these conversations were taking place in the halls of power in London, this was the reality on the ground in Bengal. 3 million. Men, women, children. Just let that number sink in. But if you need one more piece of evidence to understand his mindset, well, here it is. This is a note Churchill supposedly wrote on a file that was detailing the horrific death toll. Instead of compassion, instead of a plan, his response was a nasty joke about his political enemy, Gandhi. It shows a level of callousness that is just staggering.
Okay, so let's put all these pieces together. What we're seeing here isn't just a story of neglect. The evidence points to something much more active, a direct obstruction of relief efforts, efforts that could have saved millions and millions of lives.
And maybe the most heartbreaking part of all of this, the world wanted to help. Both the United States and Canada saw what was happening and offered to send food aid directly to Bengal. But Churchill's government in London said no. They turned them down. And the reason? Apparently they didn't want the Americans getting involved or having any influence in their colony.
Think about that. The conclusion you're forced to draw is just devastating. Protecting the pride of the British Empire, protecting their ego, was more important than preventing millions of their own subjects from starving to death. So yeah, here in the West, we build statues to Churchill, the savior. But from another part of the world, the perspective is completely different. For a villager in Bengal, watching their children literally fade away in their arms while knowing that ships full of food were just sailing past, for them, he wasn't a hero. He was the architect of their living nightmare. And that leaves us with this massive, uncomfortable question. Can somebody be both? Can a man be a hero for saving one part of the world, while at the same time being responsible for what many would call a crime against humanity in another? How do we balance those two realities?
You know, this chapter of history is, let's be honest, often just a footnote in our classrooms, if it's mentioned at all. So we genuinely want to know what you think. Does hearing this change how you see Churchill? Is this a terrible stain on an otherwise great legacy? Or is it something more? Tell us what you think in the comments. We read every single one.
If you believe in looking at real history, the good, the bad, and the very ugly, without all the sugarcoating, then you know what to do. Make sure you hit that subscribe button so you don't miss our next explainer.
Thanks so much for joining us for this one. We really appreciate you being here. We'll see you in the next episode.